Vexthor stood at the entrance of the human building and felt nothing in his chest where fear should have lived. His people, the Kalari, had never known such an emotion, because their world had been kind to them. No predators hunted them in their evolution, no dangers lurked in their forests, and so their biology simply never developed the response that humans called fear. For thousands of years, the Kalari had considered this a gift, a sign of their superiority among the thinking species of the galaxy. They made decisions with pure logic, acted without hesitation, and never experienced the paralysis that fear brought to other races. Vexthor had been chosen as ambassador to Earth precisely because of his exceptional clarity of thought and his ability to remain calm in any situation. What the Kalari High Command wanted to understand was why humanity, a species so obviously hampered by fear and emotion, had become so successful in such a short time. The human who greeted him at the door was named Jake Morrison, and he wore the uniform of Earth's unified military forces. Jake extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting, and Vexthor grasped it firmly, having studied their customs during the long journey to Earth. Jake's hand was warm and slightly damp, which Vexthor's research told him indicated nervousness in humans. This puzzled him because there was no logical reason for Jake to be nervous. They were meeting in a secure facility. Both sides wanted peaceful relations, and no threat existed in the immediate environment. Yet the human's biology responded as if danger lurked nearby. Jake led Vexthor through corridors filled with other humans, most of whom stopped to stare at the tall, gray-skinned alien walking among them. Vexthor's species stood nearly 7 feet tall with long limbs and large eyes that could see into the ultraviolet spectrum. His skin had a smooth, almost metallic quality that reflected light in interesting ways. He noticed that some humans moved closer to look at him, while others stepped back and averted their eyes. The ones who stepped back showed the same biological signs as Jake: the dampness on their skin, the quickening of breath, the tension in their muscles. They were afraid of him, though he meant them no harm and had no capacity to harm them even if he wanted to. The human security measures made sure of that. The meeting room was simple and functional with a long table and chairs, designed to accommodate both human and Kalari physiology. Dr. Lisa Harper was already waiting inside, a woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back from her face. She specialized in xenobiology and had been studying the preliminary data about the Kalari for months. Next to her sat Captain Ben Walsh, whose job was to ensure security during these initial diplomatic contacts. Ben's eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the room, the doors, and even Vexthor himself. This constant vigilance seemed exhausting to Vexthor, who could assess a room's safety in seconds and then simply trust that assessment. The first hours of discussion went smoothly as both sides exchanged information about their cultures, their histories, and their hopes for cooperation. Vexthor found himself increasingly puzzled by human behavior as the conversation progressed. Lisa spoke about Earth's many wars, conflicts that had killed millions of their own species over resources, ideas, and territory. Yet she spoke of these events with something Vexthor's translator called regret, as if humans wished these wars had never happened. This made no logical sense to him. If wars were necessary for resource acquisition or territorial expansion, why feel regret about them? The Kalari had fought wars too, but they viewed them as simple mathematical equations, necessary actions to achieve necessary outcomes. Jake noticed Vexthor's confusion and tried to explain. Humans, he said, understood that war was sometimes necessary, but they never celebrated the death and destruction it caused. They remembered the cost, honored those who died, and worked to avoid repeating the same conflicts. Fear of loss, fear of death, and fear of suffering made them careful about when and how they fought. Vexthor recorded this information but could not truly understand it. How could fear make someone more careful? Fear was an impediment to clear thinking, a biological malfunction that clouded judgment. Then the alarm sounded, a harsh noise that made all the humans in the room jump to their feet. Ben's hand went immediately to his weapon as he moved toward the door, his body positioning itself between the perceived threat and the other occupants of the room. Through the door came voices shouting, and Vexthor's translator picked up words like intruder and armed and lockdown. A human had somehow breached security and was moving through the building with a weapon. Ben spoke rapidly into his communication device while Jake moved to stand near Vexthor, not in a threatening way but as if to protect him. Vexthor watched with fascination as the humans responded to the threat. Every single one of them showed the biological signs he had learned to recognize. Jake's hands trembled slightly. Lisa's breathing became rapid and shallow, and Ben's skin glistened with sweat despite the cool temperature of the room. Yet despite these obvious signs of fear, despite their bodies practically screaming at them to flee, they all moved toward the threat instead of away from it. Ben went out into the corridor first, his weapon drawn, his voice steady as he called out commands. Jake stayed at the door, ready to close and lock it if necessary, but not hiding. Even Lisa, who had no combat training, stood ready rather than cowering under the table. The situation resolved quickly. The intruder was a disturbed individual who had managed to evade security, but had no real plan and no intention of actually hurting anyone. He was subdued by security personnel within minutes, and the lockdown was lifted. But Vexthor could not stop thinking about what he had witnessed. He had seen Jake Morrison's hand shaking, had watched the man's pupils dilate and his breathing accelerate, had observed every sign of a biological system in distress. Yet Jake had not run away. He had not frozen in place. He had moved toward the danger, placing himself between that danger and others, while his entire body was telling him to do the opposite. When calm returned and they sat down again, Vexthor asked the question that had been forming in his mind. Why did humans continue to function when their biology was actively working against them? Jake and Lisa exchanged glances, and then Lisa tried to explain. Fear, she said, was not a malfunction but a feature. It heightened their senses, made them more alert, and helped them respond to genuine threats. But humans had also evolved the capacity to act despite their fear, to override the immediate impulse to flee when something more important was at stake. They called this courage, and it only existed because fear existed first. Vexthor requested permission to observe human military operations more closely, to see this interaction between fear and courage in real situations. He wanted to understand how a species could be successful while carrying such an obvious biological limitation. The Kalari High Command approved his request, curious about the same question. They assigned him to accompany human forces in whatever capacity would provide the most insight. None of them knew that their chance to observe would come sooner than expected, and that the lesson would cost far more than anyone anticipated. Jake Morrison agreed to facilitate Vexthor's request, and arrangements were made for the Kalari ambassador to join a military unit. As Vexthor left the building that day, he looked back at the humans going about their business, each one carrying inside them this thing called fear, this constant companion that warned them of danger and made every act of courage meaningful. He still did not understand it, but he was beginning to suspect that his lack of understanding represented a gap in Kalari knowledge that might be more significant than his people realized. The carrier ship UNS Valor was bigger than anything Vexthor had seen in the Kalari fleet, and its corridors buzzed with constant activity as crew members moved with purpose through the metal hallways. Colonel Ryan Hayes commanded this vessel, a man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to calculate 1,000 possibilities in every moment. He welcomed Vexthor aboard with the same formal handshake that Jake Morrison had used, and Vexthor noted that Ryan's hand did not tremble at all. Perhaps humans could train themselves out of fear responses with enough experience, though that seemed to contradict what Lisa Harper had told him about fear being a permanent feature of their biology. Vexthor had been given quarters near the observation deck where he could watch the human crew at work. Dr. Lisa Harper had joined him on this assignment, brought along to help bridge any cultural misunderstandings that might arise. She explained the daily routines of military life as Vexthor observed the humans drilling, training, and preparing for scenarios that might never happen. What struck him most was the redundancy built into every system. Humans had backup plans for their backup plans, safety protocols that seemed excessive, and constant checks of equipment that had already been checked. When he asked Lisa about this, she smiled and said it was because humans understood that mistakes could cost lives, and fear of those mistakes made them careful. Lieutenant Maya Torres ran one of the fighter squadrons on the Valor, and Vexthor was permitted to observe her briefing her pilots before a training exercise. Maya was small compared to many humans, but she carried herself with confidence that seemed to fill the room. Her pilots listened intently as she went over the exercise parameters, the safety boundaries, and the emergency procedures they would follow if something went wrong. Vexthor noticed that she mentioned the emergency procedures 3 times during the briefing. emphasizing different aspects each time. It seemed inefficient to repeat information that competent pilots would have already memorized, but none of the pilots showed any impatience with the repetition. 3 days into Vexthor's stay aboard the Valor, alarms began to sound throughout the ship. These were different from the alarm at the diplomatic building, deeper and more urgent, and the human response was immediate. Crew members ran to their stations with practiced efficiency, and within minutes the ship's course changed as it accelerated to maximum speed. Colonel Ryan's voice came over the communication system, steady and calm, informing everyone that they had received a distress call from the colony world called New Portland. The Dravek swarm had attacked without warning, and thousands of human civilians were in immediate danger. Vexthor had heard of the Dravek during his preparation for this mission. They were a hive mind species that consumed biological matter to fuel their expansion across the galaxy. The Kalari had encountered them twice before, and had calculated that the most efficient response was to avoid their territory entirely. Engaging the Dravek required resources that exceeded any potential benefit, so the Kalari simply marked their space as off-limits and went around. But humans lived on worlds that the Dravek wanted, and apparently humans did not believe in simply abandoning those worlds. The journey to New Portland took 6 hours at maximum speed, and Vexthor spent that time observing the crew prepare for combat. The change in the humans was remarkable. The casual conversation stopped, replaced by a focused communication about tactics and strategy. Weapons were checked and rechecked, armor was inspected, and pilots ran through simulation after simulation of the battle scenarios they might face. Vexthor watched Maya Torres in the pilot ready room, saw her hands move through the pre-flight checks with automatic precision, while her eyes stared at nothing, clearly visualizing what was to come. When they arrived at New Portland, the scene was worse than anyone had expected. The Dravek ships filled the orbital space around the planet, organic vessels that looked like they had been grown rather than built. The planet's surface showed fires burning in multiple locations, and the communications channels were filled with desperate calls for help from civilians trapped in the colony settlements. Colonel Ryan made the decision immediately. They would launch a rescue operation to evacuate as many people as possible, while engaging the Dravek forces to buy time. Vexthor was given permission to monitor the operation from the command center, standing beside Colonel Ryan as orders were given and received. Maya Torres launched with her squadron first, 12 small fighters against what Vexthor's quick count estimated to be more than 60 Dravek attack craft. The numerical disadvantage was obvious, yet Maya's voice on the communication channel sounded almost cheerful as she confirmed her squadron's readiness. Vexthor's analysis suggested this was a form of human psychological defense, using false emotion to mask true emotion, but he could hear the slight tremor underneath Maya's words that betrayed what she was really feeling. The fighter engagement began immediately as Maya's squadron dove into the Dravek formation. Vexthor watched on the tactical display as the small human ships weaved between the larger enemy vessels, their weapons firing in precise bursts that targeted the weak points Lisa had helped identify in Dravek biology. The communication channel filled with voices calling out targets, warnings, and status updates. Vexthor's translator worked hard to keep up with the rapid human speech, much of it compressed into codes and abbreviations that saved precious seconds. Then Vexthor heard something that stopped his thought process entirely. One of Maya's pilots, a man named Scott, called out that he was hit and losing control. His voice rose in pitch, words coming faster, and Vexthor could hear the unmistakable sound of fear. Scott was afraid, his biological response overwhelming his trained composure, and he was broadcasting that fear to everyone on the channel. Yet even as his voice shook, even as he reported that his ship was failing and his ejection system was damaged, Scott continued to fire his weapons at the enemy. He continued fighting even though his own death was now almost certain, continued trying to complete his mission even though every instinct must have been screaming at him to focus only on survival. Maya's voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear, telling Scott that help was coming and to hold on. 2 other fighters broke from their attack patterns to move toward Scott's position, putting themselves in greater danger to try to save their fellow pilot. Vexthor watched this on the tactical display and could not comprehend the mathematics of it. 3 ships were now at risk instead of 1, The mission effectiveness was reduced, and the logical action would have been to let Scott's sacrifice buy time for the others to accomplish more. But humans did not think that way, and as Vexthor watched, one of the rescuing fighters managed to position itself beneath Scott's failing craft, using its own shields to slow Scott's descent into the atmosphere enough for a barely successful ejection. On the planet's surface, Sergeant Kevin Brooks led a Marine unit into the burning colony to search for survivors. Vexthor could hear Kevin's reports to Colonel Ryan, steady and professional despite the sounds of weapons fire and explosions in the background. Kevin's unit had located a shelter where 40 civilians, including 12 children, were trapped by debris and approaching Dravik ground forces. The building's structure was unstable, damaged by the initial bombardment, and Kevin reported that his engineers estimated a 60% chance of collapse if they attempted to move the debris. Colonel Ryan asked Kevin for his assessment, and there was a pause before Kevin responded. Vexthor could hear breathing on the channel, could hear the sound of something that might have been Kevin steadying himself, and then Kevin said they were going in. The risk was acceptable because leaving the civilians meant certain death, while attempting rescue meant possible death. Vexthor understood the logic but not the emotion behind it. Why did Kevin need that pause? Why did his voice sound different when he gave his decision? What was happening in that moment of silence? Lisa Harper, standing nearby, quietly explained that Kevin was afraid. He was afraid of the building collapse, afraid of failing to save the civilians, afraid of losing his Marines, afraid of dying himself. In that pause, Kevin had felt all of those fears, had acknowledged them, and then had decided to act anyway. That was what humans did, Lisa said. They felt their fear completely and then chose their action in spite of it. Fear informed their decision but did not make their decision. Vexthor listened as Kevin's unit worked to free the trapped civilians. He heard the strain in Kevin's voice as he directed his Marines, heard the sharp commands as part of the building shifted, heard the moment of silence that meant something had gone wrong. But then he heard Kevin again, reporting that they had the civilians and were moving to the extraction point. The building collapsed seconds after they got everyone out, and Kevin's report of mission success came in a voice that shook with something Vexthor's translator called relief. The evacuation continued for 8 more hours as the Valor and her crew pulled thousands of humans from the dying colony. Maya Torres flew 5 more missions, each one bringing her squadron through the Dravik blockade to cover the evacuation shuttles. Kevin Brooks led his Marines through 3 more rescues, each one risking collapse, fire, or enemy contact. The memorial service took place in the Valor's main assembly hall 3 days after the evacuation of New Portland, and Vexthor attended because Colonel Ryan had personally invited him. The hall was filled with crew members standing in neat rows, their dress uniforms making them look somehow more vulnerable than their combat gear had. At the front of the hall stood photographs of the 37 Marines and 12 pilots who had died during the rescue operation, and below each photograph lay a folded flag from their home nations. Vexthor had learned that humans divided themselves into nations based on geography and culture, something the Kalari had abandoned thousands of years ago as inefficient. But apparently these divisions still mattered enough to be honored even in death. Colonel Ryan spoke first, reading each name slowly and clearly, and after each name the assembled crew responded with a single word that Vexthor's translator rendered as present. This confused him because the people being named were obviously not present. They were dead, but Lisa Harper quietly explained that humans believed the dead remained present in memory and spirit. It was a comforting fiction, she said, that helped the living process their grief. Vexthor recorded this as another example of humans using emotion to override logic, but he noticed that even Lisa's eyes were wet as the names were read. After the service, Vexthor requested meetings with several crew members to better understand what had happened at New Portland. Jake Morrison had joined the Valor after the battle to help coordinate the growing alliance between humans and Kalari, and he helped arrange these conversations. The first person Vexthor spoke with was Elena Rodriguez, a woman whose role was to counsel humans who had experienced trauma. Elena worked with the Marines and pilots who had survived the battle but were struggling with what they had witnessed and done. Elena's office was small and decorated, with items that seemed to have no functional purpose. Soft fabrics, pleasant colors, and images of natural landscapes. She explained that these things helped humans feel calmer and safer, another example of emotion influencing their environment. When Vexithor asked her about fear and how it affected human soldiers, Elena smiled and said that fear was not the enemy humans thought it was. Fear had evolved to protect them by making them aware of danger and motivating them to avoid it. The problem came when fear became overwhelming and prevented action. But moderate fear actually improved human performance by heightening alertness and focus. This contradicted what Vexithor had assumed about fear. He had believed it was purely negative, a biological flaw that hindered human effectiveness. But Elena showed him research data that demonstrated humans experiencing moderate fear performed better in crisis situations than humans experiencing no fear at all. Their reaction times improved, their decision-making became more careful, and their awareness of surroundings increased. Fear was not a malfunction but a tool, and humans who learned to work with their fear rather than against it became more capable, not less. Elena introduced Vexithor to one of her patients, a young Marine named Danny Cole who had frozen during combat at New Portland. Danny sat in Elena's office and told his story with visible shame, describing how he had entered a burning building with his unit, but had been unable to move when a section of ceiling collapsed near him. His body had simply stopped responding to his commands, locked in place by overwhelming fear, and his squad leader had to physically drag him to safety. Danny believed he was a coward and a failure, words that clearly caused him pain to speak. But Elena gently corrected him, explaining that Danny's response was normal and biological. His fear had temporarily overwhelmed his training, which could happen to any human under sufficient stress. What mattered was what Danny did next, and he had requested to return to duty rather than accept a medical discharge. He was working with Elena to understand his fear response and develop strategies to manage it in future situations. Danny admitted that he was still afraid, that the thought of going into combat again terrified him. But he wanted to face that fear because his squad needed him, and because he needed to prove to himself that one moment of paralysis did not define who he was. Vexithor found this fascinating. A Kalari soldier who failed in combat would simply be reassigned to duties that better matched their capabilities. There would be no shame because shame required an emotional response to failure that the Kalari did not possess. But Danny felt shame deeply, and yet that shame somehow motivated him to improve rather than to give up. The human emotional system was far more complex than Vexithor had realized, with feelings that seemed negative actually producing positive outcomes. Jake Morrison shared his own experience with fear when Vexithor asked him directly about it. Jake had been in ground combat during a previous conflict, where his unit was ambushed and surrounded. He described the absolute terror of that moment, the certainty that he was about to die, and the way his body had reacted with shaking hands, rapid heartbeat, and the overwhelming urge to run. But he had not run because his training and his loyalty to his unit were stronger than his fear. He had continued fighting, and his unit had survived, but Jake said he still had nightmares about that day years later. What struck Vexithor was Jake's willingness to discuss this openly. The Kalari never spoke of their weaknesses or failures, because doing so served no logical purpose. But humans seem to find strength in sharing their vulnerabilities, in acknowledging their fears to each other, and in realizing that others experienced similar struggles. Jake explained that knowing he was not alone in his fear made it easier to bear, and hearing about how others had overcome similar situations gave him confidence that he could do the same. Vexithor requested access to the Kalari military database to compare human and Kalari combat performance, and what he found surprised him. The Kalari had superior technology and greater physical strength than humans, yet in actual combat situations, human forces often achieved better outcomes. Kalari commanders made logical decisions based on mathematical probability, but they sometimes failed to account for variables that human commanders instinctively understood. Human commanders anticipated enemy actions by imagining what they would fear if they were in the enemy's position, effectively using fear as a predictive tool. Kalari commanders could not do this because they could not imagine fearing anything. More importantly, Kalari forces sometimes took unnecessary casualties because they did not feel fear's warning signals. They would advance into dangerous situations without the caution that fear provided, trusting their calculations and ignoring the possibility that their calculations might be wrong. Humans, warned by their fear responses, approached dangerous situations more carefully and with more backup plans. They assumed things would go wrong because fear taught them that things often did go wrong, and this pessimistic preparation often saved lives. Admiral Patricia Grant arrived on the Valor to coordinate the defense planning against the Dravek threat, and Vexthor was invited to attend the strategy meetings. Patricia was an older human with white hair and a face marked by what Jake called worry lines, physical signs of a lifetime spent being concerned about things. She greeted Vexthor with respect but also with obvious concern, and when he asked her what worried her, she listed several dozen potential problems with the defense plans they were developing. Each problem had a low probability of occurring, but Patricia insisted on preparing for all of them anyway. During the strategy discussions, Vexthor observed something remarkable. The human commanders advocated for cautious plans with multiple fallback positions and retreat options, while the Kalari representatives who joined via communication link pushed for more aggressive strategies. The Kalari argued that the most efficient approach was to engage the Dravek with maximum force at the earliest opportunity, destroying as many of their ships as possible before they could adapt to Kalari tactics. This made logical sense based on the available data, but Patricia pushed back, arguing that aggressive strategies assumed everything would go according to plan, and her experience taught her that nothing ever went according to plan. She wanted conservative approaches that protected human lives even if they were less efficient in terms of enemy casualties. The Kalari representatives seemed frustrated by this, viewing it as an unwillingness to accept necessary losses for strategic gain. Vexthor found himself in the unusual position of understanding both perspectives, but increasingly sympathizing with the human approach. Patricia explained her thinking directly to Vexthor when he asked. Every life lost was not just a statistical reduction in combat effectiveness, but a person with family, friends, and value beyond their military function. Fear of losing those people made her cautious, made her question aggressive plans, and made her demand multiple safety measures even when they seemed excessive. The Kalari saw this as emotional thinking that compromised military effectiveness. But Patricia argued that it actually improved effectiveness by keeping soldiers alive to fight another day. Dead soldiers could not learn from experience, could not develop better tactics, and could not train the next generation. Vexthor spent hours reviewing the combat records of both species, and finally had to acknowledge what the data showed. Human forces sustained fewer casualties per day. The emergency meeting was called at what humans measured as 0300 hours, a time when most of the Valor's crew should have been sleeping. Vexthor had learned that humans required regular periods of unconsciousness to function properly, another biological limitation that the Kalari viewed as inefficient since they only needed to rest once every 4 days. But when the alert sounded through the ship, every human moved quickly to their stations despite being pulled from sleep, and within minutes the command center was fully staffed and operational. Admiral Patricia Grant's face appeared on the main display, transmitted from the Fleet Coordination Center on Earth. Her expression was grave as she shared the intelligence that reconnaissance drones had gathered. The Dravek swarm was moving in 2 massive formations, one heading toward Earth and one toward the Kalari homeworld of Kalari Prime. The forces were roughly equal in size, and each was large enough to overwhelm the defenses of either planet, if not opposed by significant military strength. The situation was exactly what military strategists called a worst-case scenario. 2 critical targets under simultaneous threat with insufficient resources to defend both adequately. Vexthor watched the human commanders absorb this information, saw the moment when they understood the impossible choice facing them. The Alliance fleet could be split to provide partial defense for both worlds, but this meant neither defense would be strong enough to guarantee success. Alternatively, they could concentrate their forces to save one world while abandoning the other to certain destruction. The mathematics were brutal and clear, and Vexthor calculated that the logical choice would be to save whichever world had the greater strategic value or population size. The Kalari High Command wasted no time making their position clear. A communication arrived within minutes demanding that the entire Alliance fleet be deployed to defend Kalari Prime. The reasoning was logical. Kalari Prime had the larger population, the more advanced industrial capacity, and the greater strategic importance to the overall alliance. Earth, being a newer member of the galactic community and having a smaller total population, should be given whatever defensive resources could be spared after Kalari Prime's protection was assured. The message concluded by stating that this was not a request, but an expectation based on rational analysis of the situation. Vexthor felt that strange sensation in his chest again, stronger than before, as he read the Kalari High Command's message. His people were demanding that Earth be sacrificed for Kalari survival, and they saw nothing wrong with this calculation. They could not understand that the humans listening to this demand would feel betrayed, would feel that their lives were being valued as less important than Kalari lives. The Kalari could not feel how their words would impact the Alliance because they could not imagine the emotional weight of being told you were expendable. Admiral Patricia. Grant's response was quiet and measured, but Vexthor could hear something beneath her words that his translator struggled to identify. She thanked the Kalari High Command for their input, but stated that humanity would not abandon their homeworld based on a calculation of strategic value. Every human world mattered, every human life mattered, and decisions about where to deploy forces would be made collectively by the Alliance leadership rather than by unilateral demand. She then asked Colonel Ryan Hayes to present his tactical assessment of the situation. Ryan stood before the assembled commanders and laid out the reality they faced. If they split the fleet evenly between Earth and Kalari Prime, both defenses would be marginal with roughly 40% chance of success for each world. If they concentrated forces at one location, that world would have an 80% chance of survival, while the other would have near zero chance. The third option, which Ryan presented with obvious reluctance, was to attempt a risky strategy that might allow them to defend both locations, but required perfect execution and some luck. The risky strategy involved using the faster human ships to engage the Dravik force heading toward Earth first, hoping to inflict enough damage to slow their advance. Then those ships would jump to Kalari Prime to reinforce the defense there before returning to Earth for a second engagement. It required the human ships and crews to fight two major battles back-to-back, with minimal rest between, and it assumed everything would go according to plan, with no significant complications. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Admiral Patricia asked for input from her commanders, and the room fell silent. Vexthor watched the humans exchange glances, saw them engaging in the nonverbal communication that their species used so effectively. Finally, Ryan Hayes spoke up and volunteered his ship, the Valor, to lead the assault on the earthbound Dravik force. He explained that his crew was experienced, his ship was fast, and he trusted them to execute the difficult double engagement. Other captains immediately volunteered their ships as well, and within minutes they had assembled a strike force, willing to take on the most dangerous part of the plan. The Kalari High Command rejected this strategy as too risky and reiterated their demand that all forces be concentrated at Kalari Prime. They argued that attempting to defend both worlds would likely result in losing both, while accepting the loss of Earth would guarantee the survival of at least one world and the continuation of the Alliance. It was pure logic, pure mathematics, and it completely failed to account for the fact that humans would never agree to abandon their homeworld no matter what the calculations. Said Vexthor found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to speak. He addressed the Kalari High Command directly, his words being transmitted back to his homeworld. And he said something that shocked everyone in the command center. He said that he believed the human strategy was correct, and that the Kalari High Command was making a mistake by demanding full protection. The humans had shown repeatedly that they could achieve outcomes that exceeded logical predictions because their fear made them careful, their emotional bonds made them fight harder, and their unwillingness to abandon each other gave them motivation that pure logic could not match. The silence that followed his statement was profound. The Kalari High Command responded with what his translator called rebuke, informing Vexthor that he had overstepped his authority and that his judgment appeared to be compromised by excessive exposure to human emotional thinking. He was ordered to remove himself from the command structure and to report to Kalari representatives who would ensure he received proper psychological evaluation. Vexthor acknowledged the order, but did not move from his position in the command center, and Admiral Patricia Grant did not ask him to leave. Patricia made the final decision that the human strike force would proceed with Ryan's plan. She also made a decision that surprised Vexthor. She split the remaining Alliance forces equally between Earth and Kalari Prime, rather than concentrating them at the Kalari homeworld as demanded. She explained that this was not optimal by mathematical standards, but it honored the commitment that Alliance members would defend each other equally. If the Kalari High Command wanted to redeploy their own ships away from Earth to reinforce Kalari Prime, that was their choice. But human forces would remain split equally. Captain Helen Foster was assigned to command the fleet element defending Kalari Prime, and Vex Thor observed her receiving her orders with a calm professionalism that he now recognized as a mask over significant stress. Helen would be defending a world that was not her own, protecting people who had just demanded that her homeworld be abandoned, and doing so because she believed in the Alliance principles even when others did not. When Vex Thor approached her to express gratitude for her willingness to defend Kalari Prime, Helen simply said that it was her duty and that humans honored their commitments even when others failed to honor theirs. The preparations for battle consumed the next 2 days as ships moved into position and crews made ready for combat. Vex Thor remained aboard the Valor despite the orders from his government, and Jake Morrison supported his decision by pointing out that Vex Thor's official role as ambassador gave him some diplomatic immunity from military orders. The truth was that Vex Thor could not imagine leaving now, not when he was finally beginning to understand what humans had been trying to teach him. Maya Torres and her squadron prepared for what would be their most difficult mission yet. They would launch first, engaging the Dravek forces to provide cover for the larger ships during the initial assault. The casualty projections for fighter squadrons were grim, with models suggesting that 40 to 60% of pilots might not survive the engagement. Maya briefed her pilots with her usual steady voice, going over the tactics and strategies they would employ, but Vex Thor could hear the tremor underneath her words now. She was afraid, and so was every pilot in that room. Yet not one of them requested to be removed from the mission. Vex Thor asked Maya why she continued to fly when she knew the risks, when she had already lost so many pilots at New Portland, when her fear must be telling her to find a safer assignment. Maya looked at him with those human eyes that always seemed to hold more depth than he expected, and she said that fear made her careful, but did not make her quit. The Dravek swarm appeared on the tactical displays like a dark stain spreading across space, hundreds of organic ships moving with the coordination of a single mind. Vex Thor had studied the Dravek before, knew their capabilities and their patterns, but seeing them approach Earth in such overwhelming numbers made his newly developed fear response surge through his body in ways he still did not fully understand. His breathing quickened without conscious command, and his hands gripped the edge of the console harder than necessary. Lisa Harper noticed and gave him a small nod of understanding, a silent acknowledgement that what he was feeling was normal and shared by everyone around him. Colonel Ryan's voice cut through the tension in the command center, calm and clear as he gave the order for all ships to move into attack formation. The Valor led the strike force forward, its engines pushing the massive carrier to speeds that made the hull vibrate with strain. Around them, destroyers and cruisers took up positions in the carefully planned formation that would maximize their defensive coverage while allowing for rapid tactical adjustments. Maya Torres and her fighter squadron launched from the Valor's bays, their small ships accelerating ahead of the main fleet to begin the engagement. Vex Thor monitored multiple communication channels simultaneously, a skill that came naturally to Kalari biology, even if processing the emotional content of those communications was still new to him. He heard Maya's voice directing her pilots into attack patterns, heard the responses confirming readiness, and heard beneath all of it the current of fear that ran through every transmission. The pilots knew what they were flying into, knew the casualty projections, yet they flew anyway. Scott, the pilot who had nearly died at New Portland, was back in his fighter and responding to Maya's commands with the same steady professionalism as the others, despite what he had already survived. The first weapons exchange lit up the darkness of space with energy beams and missile trails. The Dravek ships returned fire with their organic weapons, projectiles grown rather than manufactured that sought targets with disturbing intelligence. Vex Thor watched the tactical display as 3 human fighters vanished from the screen in the first 30 seconds of combat, gone so quickly that he barely had time to register their call signs before they were simply absent. Maya's voice never wavered as she adjusted squadron tactics to account for the losses, redirecting remaining fighters to cover the gaps left by the dead. On Earth's surface, Jake Morrison coordinated the ground defense from a command center deep beneath what humans called the North American continent. Vexthor had a communication link to Jake's position and could hear the controlled chaos of a military headquarters preparing for invasion. Jake was implementing evacuation procedures for coastal populations where the Dravek were most likely to land first, moving millions of civilians to safer locations while trying to position military forces to defend the most critical infrastructure. The fear in Jake's voice was evident when he reported to Admiral Patricia that they simply did not have enough time to evacuate everyone, that some people would be trapped in the landing zones when the Dravek arrived. Patricia's response showed the burden of command in a way that Vexthor had never witnessed among Kalari leaders. She told Jake to save who he could save and to prepare defensive positions for the rest, her voice carrying the weight of knowing that her orders would result in civilian deaths. There was no logical calculation that could make that decision easier, no mathematical formula that removed the human cost from the equation. Patricia was afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of the deaths that would result from her commands. Yet she continued to give those commands because someone had to, and because fear did not eliminate the need for leadership. The Valor shook as Dravek weapons found their target, and damage reports flooded the command center. Ryan assessed the information quickly and ordered repairs to begin, while adjusting the ship's position to better utilize their intact shield generators. Vexthor marveled at how humans could focus on immediate problems while simultaneously planning 3 and 4 moves ahead, a skill that seemed to come from their constant anticipation of things going wrong. The Kalari would have followed their battle plan more rigidly, trusting in the calculations that had gone into its creation. But humans adapted continuously because fear taught them that no plan survived, contact with reality unchanged. Kevin Brooks led his Marine units in a desperate holding action at a defensive line outside one of Earth's major cities. The Dravek had broken through the orbital defenses faster than projected and were landing forces across the planet's surface. Kevin's communication with the command center was choppy with interference, but Vexthor could hear weapons fire and the sounds of battle behind his words. Kevin reported that his position was being overrun, but that they were buying time for the civilian evacuation behind them. He requested permission to fall back, but Jake Morrison told him to hold as long as possible because the evacuation was not complete. Vexthor listened to this exchange and understood that Jake had just ordered Kevin to likely die so that others could live. He understood that Kevin knew this and was accepting it, that the Marines under Kevin's command knew it and were accepting it. The fear they felt was overwhelming, transmitted clearly through their communications, yet they held their position because the alternative was abandoning the civilians who had not yet escaped. This was the terrible mathematics of war that humans understood in ways the Kalari did not. The calculation that said some deaths could prevent other deaths, but the emotional cost of that calculation was written in every word Kevin spoke. Maya's squadron continued their assault on the Dravek fleet, and Vexthor tracked their dwindling numbers with growing distress. They had lost half their fighters in the first wave of combat, yet Maya pressed the attack because every Dravek ship they destroyed was one less ship that would reach Earth's surface. Scott's fighter took damage that should have forced him to retreat, but he stayed in the fight, his voice tight with pain as he continued to engage targets. When Maya ordered him to fall back to the Valor, Scott argued that he could still fight, that his weapons still worked even if his shields were gone. Maya made it in direct order, and Scott reluctantly broke off his attack run to limp back toward the carrier. The battle at Kalari Prime was proceeding simultaneously, and Vexthor monitored those reports with the same growing fear he felt for the Earth engagement. Captain Helen Foster commanded the defense fleet there, and her transmissions showed a tactical situation that was even more challenging than Earth. The Kalari forces were taking heavy casualties because they refused to implement the tactical retreats that Helen recommended. Kalari commanders saw retreat as inefficient, as wasting the advantage of positions already held, and they continued to hold those positions even when doing so was clearly futile. Helen's frustration came through clearly in her communications with the Kalari commanders. She explained that retreating from an untenable position preserved forces to fight again from a better position, that trading space for time was a fundamental military principle, but the Kalari could not overcome their logical calculation that retreat meant giving ground to the enemy. Vexthor found himself transmitting directly to the Kalari fleet, using his authority as an ambassador to order them to follow Helen's tactical guidance. The Kalari commanders initially refused, citing his compromised judgment. But when several more ships were destroyed holding positions that Helen had told them to abandon, they reluctantly began following human tactical doctrine. The change was immediate and dramatic. The Kalari forces began using the tactical withdrawals that humans had perfected through centuries of warfare, falling back when pressed, using defensive positions more effectively, and preserving their strength for counterattacks when opportunities presented themselves. The casualty rate dropped significantly, and Helen's fleet began to turn the tide of the battle at Kalari Prime. Vexthor watched this transformation with a mixture of emotions he was still learning to identify. Relief that Kalari forces were surviving, sadness that it had taken so many deaths for them to learn this lesson, and something like pride that he had helped bridge the gap between human and Kalari tactical thinking. The Valor took another hit. This one more serious, and the ship shuddered so violently that Vexthor was thrown against his console. Emergency lighting activated as main power flickered, and Ryan's voice remained steady as he ordered damage control teams to critical areas. The engineering reports showed that they had lost one of their main engines, and that their hyperspace drive had taken damage that would prevent them from jumping to Kalari Prime as planned. The risky strategy that depended on the Valor fighting at both battles was falling apart because the ship could not make the journey between them. Ryan made a decision that Vexthor recognized as purely human in its logic. He ordered the other ships in his strike force to break off and jump to Kalari Prime, while the Valor remained at Earth to continue the fight. This reduced the reinforcements that Helen would receive and lowered Earth's defensive capability, but it honored the commitment to defend both worlds even when circumstances made that commitment difficult to fulfill.